Hi, I'm going to talk to you today about the theme of queerness within Anne of Green Gables. Throughout the book, Anne is not very interested in any boys except at the very end of the book, but instead seeks intimacy with her friend Diane Barry, as well as the wisdom of Diane's great aunt, Miss Josephine Barry, who is an unmarried, older rich woman. Kind of this idea of what is sometimes termed the spinster of an unmarried woman is often associated with lesbianism back in the day because it was a way for women to not be forced to marry men and just be themselves without being openly gay. Anne's relationship with Diane, who she calls her bosom friend, is not approved at first by Diane's mother, especially when Anne accidentally gets Diane drunk. And then Diane has to break up with Anne, which really causes a lot of heartbreak between the two girls. Several scholars, such as Holly Blackford, have explored Anne's queer coded nature and her, especially her bosom friendship with Diane. As Holly Blackford states, Anne has a distaste for conventional gender roles, a feeling of difference and social ostracization, sensitivity to beauty, and precocious passions that symbolize sexual excitements regardless of intent, unquote. One scholar who was one of the first ones to talk about the queer coded nature of Anne was a Canadian professor named Laura Robson, who in 2000 presented this paper called Bosom Friends Lesbian Desire in Montgomery's Anne books. And this paper caused quite a stir. It was talked about a lot in the CBC news at the time. And in fact, the Prince Edward Island tourism was worried that now Anne was going to be seen as a lesbian and it would really affect the tourism of the island. In terms of openly queer young adult books, the first ones ever were John Donovan's 1969 book, All Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip, who was the first gay character. And then the first openly lesbian character was Nancy Garden's 1982 book, Anne on My Mind. The fact that Anne of Green Gables is not an openly gay character, but queer coded themes throughout the book that appeal to a lot of people. There's a lot of Tumblrs about Anne's queerness. Anne's kind of beats these two openly gay characters by over 60 years. And in fact, a lot of the first openly gay characters in books were actually had really terrible endings and were kind of punished for their queerness. And that really doesn't happen with Anne. Anne gets to be herself. So, as a queer child, I was really happy to read queer coded books because I never found openly queer young adult books. So, I would read something like Harriet the Spy and see the inherent lesbianism, even though Harriet is not deemed a lesbian character. Since the early to late 2000s, there's been a whole bunch of new young adult books that are directly open gay characters who are not punished for their gayness. And so youth nowadays might not actually find comfort in Anne. They might actually question why she isn't more of a lesbian or a bisexual. And in the author's own 1932 journal, the author declares that I'm not a lesbian. However, also in the same journal where the author writes that she's not a lesbian, she also um, declares her love for her best friend and goes into terms like, my own dearest love, I wish that instead of writing you, I could go to you and get my arms around you and kiss you. And she also talks about these women who fall in love with her and don't even realize that they're being lesbians or conscious of the lesbianism. Montgomery had a lot of women who were flaunting themselves to her. But as a queer individual, I always say that it's never good to out a person who wasn't out in their time. And there's many reasons that maybe Montgomery was a lesbian or bisexual, but because the time it was seen as such a negative thing, maybe she wasn't, or maybe she was, but just never declared herself it. Having the queer reading of Anne, it really helps feed into this legend that Montgomery was an openly gay author when that wasn't really the case. So, in terms of maybe more openly gay characters that have similar structures as Anne and themes as Anne, The first one I suggest is Dan in Green Gables, which is a point for point same plot line as Anne of Green Gables. It's a graphic novel about Dan, a gay Latino and white individual who ends up being orphaned and must move in with his religious grandparents in rural Tennessee. And throughout the book, it's really emphasizing Dan's queerness and also his mixed race identity. And he doesn't shy away from these things, even when he's being bullied by his high school classmates or has a lot of anger coming from him from his unaccepted grandfather. I also suggest Cross My Heart and Never Die. And this is a graphic novel centering on a 12-year-old Tuva who has two best friends. Tuva kind of realizes that she's falling in love with a girl, but she's worried about telling anyone because she's worried about being judged. So, like Anne, Cross My Heart centers on trusted friendships and trying to be yourself, even though you feel like you are an outsider outside of a community. Thank you so much.